field of Republican presidential candidates is widening this week, with two more candidates officially entering the race. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina made his announcement at an event in his hometown of North Charleston on Monday, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made his announcement virtually on Twitter, alongside CEO Elon Musk after technical issues delayed the stream. These additions bring the total to 9 candidates, with more expected to enter. In fact, just today, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu said he will decide in the next week or two if he wants to join the race. He says his decision will ultimately come down to what's best for the party.
The money's been lined up, the support's been lined up, there's a pathway to win. All those boxes are checked. The family's on board, which is always a big one. I just got to make sure it's right for the party and right for me.
GOP strategist John Hart joins us now to weigh in on how the Republican presidential field is shaping up and getting quite crowded. He's executive director of the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions Action, or C3 Action, and he also previously served as the communications director to Republican Senator Tom Coburn. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. So to start, what do you think candidates need to do to differentiate themselves from former President Donald Trump, but without losing Republican support? This is a tough line to walk, to stand out in a party that's quite literally been quite divided based on whether people are Trump Republicans or never Trumpers.
Great, Alexa, thanks for having me on again. You know, that's a great question, great way to set up the segment. Look, I think what all the candidates are betting on is that the race is going to look fundamentally different 6 months from now than it does today. In fact, I was just in New Hampshire a couple of weeks ago talking to Governor Sununu, and his point, which is the point that all the challengers are making, is someone is going to catch fire who's not in the front runner conversation right now. And it's always instructive to go back and look at where the polls were at previous points in races in the past. In 2008, the front runner was Mike Huckabee at this stage around Memorial Day. In 2012, Sarah Palin and Ron Paul were beating Mitt Romney in some polls. So the conventional wisdom today that Trump is the front runner, he just had another kind of bump and a boost, partly in reaction to the indictment, the CNN town hall. DeSantis has gone down a bit, but now he's officially in the race. His rollout was a bit shaky on the technical side, but the substance was compelling, I think, to a lot of voters. That's a recoverable mistake. It's not a fatal error. So look, I think what DeSantis is arguing is, look, I'm the one who's going to be more loyal to Trump's agenda even than Trump was. In other words, Donald Trump is so chaotic, he's so schizophrenic that he doesn't know what he stands for politically and ideologically. And even though 30% of the base is hardcore with Trump, that leaves 70% that is arguably up for grabs. Sure, some of the polls have Trump over 50, but those are national. If you look at the state-by-state polls, Trump is not above 50 in any of the averages. And when you have a candidate who's the former president under 50% in all the early primary states, that gives DeSantis, Sununu, everyone else in the race, Tim Scott, a lot of motivation to stand and make their case and hopefully persuade the voters that they're the person who's best equipped to take on Joe Biden.
And let's talk a little bit more about Ron DeSantis. He, of course, officially entered the race this week, but is already polling as a distant second. He kind of lost momentum in recent weeks as his fight against Disney has ramped up. He has positioned himself, as you mentioned, as kind of a light version of Donald Trump, more sticking to the policies without maybe all of the headlines to go with it. But there are doubts about his ability to take on Trump on a national stage. Do you think there is a winning path for DeSantis? And if so, what does that look like?
No, I do. And I think the winning path for DeSantis, if he goes back to his constitutional conservative roots, then he has the capacity and opportunity to appeal to that 70% of the Republican Party that I would describe loosely as after Trumpers. They're not never Trumpers, but they're ready to move on from Donald Trump. And, the party's not in a nostalgic mood right now. The 1980s is not where we're going to go. But the fact is, Ronald Reagan is an example of how a leader can fuse the populist elements of the party and other foreign policy social conservatives together. And Ron DeSantis has shown the capacity to do that with the way he's governed in Florida. Now, politics is more the same than it is different, actually, over the years. So if DeSantis can repeat some of that magic that Reagan discovered, that others have discovered in the past, he has an opportunity to be the nominee. And that's his pathway, is to say Trump is not an authentic conservative. Conservatism is a second language to Donald Trump. It is not to Ron DeSantis. It's not to Tim Scott and a lot of the other candidates in this race.
Now, there are 8 other candidates that have already declared, other than the former president, with more expected, maybe Mike Pence jumping into the ring. Do you think a more crowded field will help or hurt former President Trump's campaign? Or, does anyone have the power to even come close?
Well, I think it's too soon to say. I think it cuts both ways. I think the more people you have in the race, one of the interesting dynamics in this race right now is a lot of the candidates are so hesitant and they're too cautious to go after Trump. An exception actually is Ron DeSantis. Chris Christie, who will probably jump in, has said very explicitly, you have to go after the front runner. Logic dictates that if you're in a race when there's one person clearly in the lead, you have to displace that person as the front runner. And he's criticized the other candidates for being too tepid. And Ron DeSantis is now the exception, along with Chris Christie, who's willing to engage Trump directly. And that will help. If you have enough candidates critiquing Trump, that can have the effect of telling that 70% of GOP voters, maybe there is a better choice. But then when you get to the crunch time, you've got to have some of these candidates willing to step out if they're polling poorly or they don't win the first 2 states. And again, whether that happens or not, that may be wishful thinking at this point. It certainly didn't work in 2016, but a lot is going to happen between now and then. A lot can change that we just can't anticipate.
GOP strategist John Hart, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your insight this weekend. We appreciate it.
You bet. Happy to do it.